Greetings. I am pleased to have with us today two internationally recognized thought leaders on human potential and the prevention of needless disability. I have Dr. Les Kertay, the Chief Medical Officer of R3 Continuum, and Chris Brigham, Dr. Chris Brigham, the author of Living Abled and Healthy, A Guide to Injury and Illness Recovery. You can see more of his work at livingabled.com as well. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. The focus of today's discussion is living abled. We're going to explore this topic and discuss some of the feedback we've received from others about what living abled means to them. Chris, I'm going to start with you. So we're familiar with the term disabled, but what does the term abled mean to you?
Well, John, thanks for having me involved in the conversation today, and Les, I look forward to exploring this with you. John, when we decided on the title for the book, Living Abled and Healthy, I wanted to have a positive focus, and so we chose the term abled, and it's a less commonly seen word. In fact, I needed to initially work with Microsoft Word that it wouldn't try to correct the spelling for something else. But what abled means, it's defined as having a full range of physical or mental abilities, not disabled. And the strongest use of abled is to define us as capable of successfully living healthy and productive lives, whether or not we have our full range of abilities. And we apply abled to how we live, how we experience each moment, therefore living abled. So it has a positive approach to how we can experience our lives despite restrictions or limitations that we may have.
Okay, and why did you focus on abled rather than disabled, or ability versus disability?
Well, I'd rather focus on the, John, on the positive things in life rather than the negative things. So often we talk about pain or what we can't do or this or that, but that really gets us stuck in a sort of downhill, spiral. And by using positive terms such as living abled, it keeps us moving in an upwards direction, giving us the potential that we all deserve.
And Les, what does the term living abled mean to you?
I think that as I was listening to Chris's response, I think that he hit on something really important, which is that it's about the way that we live. Too often the word disabled is applied to a person, and living abled is really about the way that we live regardless of our capacities. So, the two of you know that I'm very interested in human resilience and the ways in which people adapt and recover and get stronger from things that happen. And that's really what living abled is to me. It's living in with all of our capacities that we have access to and adapting to our circumstances.
So, I'm sorry, the UPS guy decided to show up in the middle of our thing too, right?
That's all right, Seamus deserves his moment of fame.
There you go. So, I want to share with the two of you some of we did a survey at our booth at the Workers' Comp Institute conference in Orlando, and then actually an online survey as well, and people responded to some tweets. And I'd like to have the two of you comment on some of those responses. And also, for those of you in the audience, I'd like to encourage you to add your own thoughts as to what it means to be abled within the chat box. And we'll comment on those as well. So the first response I'd like to talk about is the definition of living abled as living life to its fullest, enjoying life each day. For me, being with my family and enjoying each minute as much as possible. Les, do you want to comment on that one?
Well, I think it takes the idea of the positives and focusing on the positives and puts those front and center. That definition. I think that it possibly, it may misrepresent, and this is really the downside of focusing on the positive, and the downside of positive psychology is that well, you know what? Sometimes I have something go wrong for me and it makes me unhappy, and that's okay too. So I think we need to broaden the definition. But I think it's perfectly captures the idea of making the most of whatever our circumstances are.
And
Chris?
John, you know what I like about that statement too is it brings in the aspect of not just what we do or work. It's family. It's enjoying every life, you know, every minute that we have, and we could frame things in a either negative way or positive way. And you know, I think your dog Seamus is a good example. Now, what I mean by that is you could respond to that and say, oh my gosh, here we are doing a live presentation. We may have thousands of people here, and Seamus is wandering around the room and barking at the neighbors. So that could be like, oh no, this is happening and this is negative, and oh, you know, how this happened. Or it could be just, this is amusing, this is positive, this is part of our whole human experience, so we embrace it. And it just gives us a whole different orientation to life. Do you agree with that, Les?
Yeah, very much, very much.
Positive.
Oh,
Yes,
that's great.
We have a pun master in the room, apparently. So very nicely done.
That's awesome.
So, also, you know, this also seems to reflect on balance. You know, I'd like to hear either of you comment on just the idea of balance here with this particular statement.
Well, you know, balance is, for me, it's a challenge because there are so many things I want to be doing in my life, and how do I balance, you know, my personal life and my family and my friends, what I have with joys with that, and work, which I have joys in different aspects of it. So it's almost like continually balancing, and maybe I shouldn't have so many balls up in the air and it'd be easier, but I think it's just being excited about life. And I think when you're excited and you're positive, there are many things going on. At least, you know, that's my experience. But it does require balance. But in terms of a positive orientation to that, Les, you've been so experienced in the field of disability prevention, and as your background as a psychologist, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think again, it's balance in the sense of doing all that you can with what's available to you. Is, you know, that allows us to be realistic about what our capabilities are. It allows us to be present with who we are. That's really what balance is about to me. And I think that's another aspect of living abled, is being present to who we are and what our capabilities are and aren't. I think that's, I think that's the thing that comes to mind for me. And that's really also my definition of psychologically healthy.
And Les, when you say that is in the present, that it brings to mind too that my own experiences in that with others is that if we're right in the present, then we really experience the potential of life. And that so often we see people who have been disabled by, you know, the systems or various processes, get stuck more in the past. So they define themselves as, you know, this is who I was, now I'm this, and this is just not satisfactory for me. And they'll start focusing all the negative changes that have occurred, but they can't really focus on the present, and they really can't move into a future which would have the more joy for them. Thoughts on that?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think you're saying it perfectly. That's exactly right.
So let's move on to the next response we got to the question about defining the definition of living abled, which was being happy with your daily life, accepting life, and overcoming challenges. Chris, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. Well, I think it's part of what we have. It's being in the present, you know, just being happy with whatever comes our way, and also recognizing that, I mean, there will be times that there'll be sadness, but as much as possible, really focus on the joys that we have, and accepting that things happen in our life, and that's just part of the process. So that the challenges that we encounter, they're not barriers in our life. They're just part of our life. We just go on to it, and then we get into the we build on strengths that we have, and particularly the issues of resiliency. And maybe as the conversation unfolds, we can discuss more about the work that you've done in that area too, Les.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's well, I don't want to keep repeating myself, but again, it's that this response really captures that notion of responding from our inner capacities. It's that it really gets at that notion of psychological resilience, and that's really the remarkable thing to me. Often is that it's easy when we get into the field of disability prevention and disability medicine. It's easy to focus on the people who are having trouble recovering, when we lose sight of the fact that most people actually are pretty resilient, regardless of what happens to them, and we figure out ways to live, and that idea of living with being the best that we can be is just it's a perfect description of it.
All right, very good. And then let's move into because we certainly have several of these. So
yeah.
So how about living abled is doing what one wants to do in life? It's participating in social, occupational, and family life. Les, why don't you start with that one?
The first thing that comes to mind when I looked at that response was that I've often had people describe to me, people with visible disabilities, somebody who's uses a wheelchair for mobility, for example. That a comment of a friend of mine has been that it's really he's only disabled when the environment doesn't allow him access to the things that he needs, a way to get around. When he's confronted with a set of stairs, that creates a disability that if there's a ramp or he doesn't, or some sort of a lift, that there is no disability. It's being able to participate. And in terms of work and return to work and people being able to be at work, that's really the function of accommodations. When someone has a disability and you have a reasonable accommodation that allows somebody to participate in work life, that's exactly what we're talking about. And I think some of your emphasis is on the individual taking responsibility for themselves of putting themselves in a position where they can have that access, and kind of advocating for themselves. And I think that's an important part of this conversation as well.
And unless it's free, and it's obviously it's both parts. It's the individual, the resiliency, but there need to be accommodations, reasonable accommodations, such as the work we did with the ADA, so that people don't have artificial barriers there. Now, the other thing that I found intriguing about that statement is, living able is doing what one wants to do in life. So that gets to the whole issue is, what does one want to do in life? Is it appropriate? Is it realistic or not? Is it a good choice? Because there may be things we want to do in our life that may not be good choices. We have to really be clear about that. But sometimes I see people will not have their focus as high as it could be, and therefore they don't achieve that potential. So the people that I find I'm really touched by are those that have a vision of what they want to do in life, which is sometimes seems outrageous, and then they achieve it. Rather than just say, all we do in life is just to get through another day. So that's, part of it. So the other thing I liked is emphasizing, all aspects of our life, our social, our occupational, and our family life, because certainly our interactions with our family and friends, the social and in society is important. In other sessions, we've talked about the importance of work and how work itself is healthy. And then the priority of our family, those that are closest to us. So that was a very thoughtful statement, John.
And I think this one is somewhat related, but let's take this one separately as well, which is doing everything I want and am capable of doing as normally as possible. Chris, why don't you continue your thought process there?
Well, I think that's, again, trying to define what we want, and then how are we going to achieve that. And if we do have some limitations, physical or mental limitations or restrictions, how do we work around those to achieve what we want? And then how do we work with others who will then accommodate us to permit us to do that? And I think that's a responsibility from my perspective that society and employers have. And then also, as we work with others, we're working with healthcare providers, that they share that same goal, that they're going to work with us to permit us to achieve as much normalcy as possible, and to permit us to do what we want to do. Les, your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you brought in the healthcare providers, because I think that's that's been a focus for me, of helping psychologists, psychotherapists, and medical doctors to really focus on working with people around accomplishing everything that they can accomplish and helping them with that. Because let's face it, where do we go when we have a problem? We go to our we go to our therapist, or we go to our family doctor. And their role in this, in helping people to live as fully as possible, is really, really critical.
And that really needs to be a focus, and that's a whole other conversation. That's that you and I have had, that in healthcare, that often the focus is on diagnosing a condition and doing tests, and it's really very narrowly medically focused, rather than dealing with the whole person, biopsychosocial. And from my perspective, the very important issue of focusing on function. So we sometimes are very too narrow, and we don't achieve what we do need to achieve, so people can experience all that they want to experience with life.
Yeah, exactly. It's really I'm struck by these responses that we got to this answer, that they really all have this same theme of, there are various shades of living as well as you can with what you have available to you, and finding ways to adapt and accommodate. It's really kind of stands out when as we're talking about it, it stands out for me that that's the theme that runs through all of these responses.
They do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ties into the next two responses, which I'm going to present together, because they're essentially the same. One of them being independence, or the ability to live independently. So who'd like to take that one on?
Well, I think it speaks to the issue of self-reliance, and that also self-responsibility rather than dependent on others. Now, others may assist us in our process. So we may have, talking about healthcare providers, they may assist us in dealing with certain situations, or family members. But ultimately, from my perspective, is that the responsibility for our lives is us. And therefore, we are independent, and we have to recognize that responsibility that comes with that. Les, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think also that that ties for me into the really critical piece, I think, of people being able to adapt psychologically, is feeling like you have some sense of control. That's the one thing that runs through. But we all have stressful lives. People who are highly stressed and feel like they have no control over it, no ability to impact their experience, tend to have much more negative effects of that stress. And that's really kind of what underpins that sense of wanting to be independent. It's wanting to be able to impact the way that we live and to have some sense of control. It's not perfect. It's not 100%, but we have enough that that we can really feel like we're living independently in some meaningful way.
Resiliency too, that people who are independent tend to be more resilient in dealing with the issues. And then when we look at it from a standpoint of other stakeholders, one of the concerns that we've explored before, I know you and I've had in conversations, is do the other stakeholders help us become independent, or are we codependent on them? So I could look at that in terms of a physician or a therapist. If they start taking responsibility, or we give them responsibility, you're the doctor, you fix it, or you're the employer, you caused this injury, you've got to fix it, or you're my attorney, make this right, it's putting the responsibility on someone else,
make it better,
than keeping us in control and keeping us independent.
Yeah, well, and that gets at, for me with psychotherapists, a really important piece when someone is dealing with, a disability from the standpoint of having an injury or an illness that takes them out of work. So I'm not talking about something that's long-term, but something that is kind of an immediate, takes you out of work, that we often, I think, and I think in a well-meaning way, we're trying to take care of people, we're trying to give people the opportunity to recover, but sometimes I think we end up enabling people becoming less and less independent and more dependent on that support. And I think that's where my emphasis, and again, as you said, you and I've done a lot with this, trying to work with providers to really help them understand that the best way to help that person is help them be as functional as possible, including whenever you can, being back at work or some meaningful activity.
Absolutely. So we moving forward, we have a little, what I think of as maybe a little more provocative comment, and it's in two parts. Living with the health and means God gives you, and use a doctor only if absolutely necessary. So, Chris, I know you have. You probably have more to talk about on the faith side. So, can you begin with that?
Well, I was really intrigued by this comment, and I think there are two aspects. First of all, the comment, living with the health and means God gives you, relates to the issues of faith. And many of us try to approach our lives within the context of our faith, whatever faith that may be, but to have a higher perspective of why we're here. And I think that's when we also talk about health, it's the body, the mind, the spirit, it's the purpose. For some of us, how we envision things is that God gives us certain gifts. And if we have those gifts, we should be using those gifts. And then if we try to restrict those, or we don't achieve our full potential, we are not utilizing the gifts that we should be using to his service. So that, for many, that's an important part of it. So I can relate to that, that statement, and I appreciate the person sharing that with us. And the other part is use a doctor only if absolutely necessary. It's intriguing, and actually, I'm going to say I agree with it for the most part. Maybe I may get in trouble with some of my colleagues for that, but and I may take out the word absolutely, but I'd say use a doctor only if necessary. And maybe that's because of my concerns with our current, healthcare system. But we don't have a healthcare system. We have fragmented components that deal with injury and illness, and we focus more on the biological aspects of the diagnosing conditions and testing, which may or may not be appropriate, and treatments, which may or may not be appropriate. And many treatments have been, grossly inappropriate, inappropriate surgeries, or the whole, this outrageous approaches, with opioids and all these harmful things. So would say that use a doctor only if absolutely necessary. I think it gets to the issue of the risk versus the benefits. And sometimes, particularly in our current system, there are significant risks and sometimes questionable benefits. So we need to be very discerning. And that's an area that I explored in Living Able and Healthy about how do we choose healthcare providers and how do we structure the relationship? Because otherwise, I think it's true that probably many times we should probably only using them if it's absolutely necessary because of the current challenges we face in the system. Provocative statement. Les, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the first thing that popped into my head is something that someone, told me once, which is that, hospitals are places for sick people. You don't want to go there if you want to get well. I'm going to put a little different spin on it. I think what occurs to me is that the very best healthcare providers that I've worked with, the people who are in my life who help me take care of my health, are people who provide me with information and then expect me to be part of the decision-making process about what we do with that information. And that kind of partnership, that takes the only if absolutely necessary kind of out of the equation for me. I have no worry about going to, my cardiologist, for example, is one of those people who really works with me in that way. I have no problem going to him to ask him a question because I know he'll give me a straight answer and not just tell me what to do. He'll then expect me to make some decisions based on that information. So I basically agree with the sentiment, but another way to handle that sentiment is make sure that you're working with people who expect you to take some accountability for your own health.
Thank you,
and I
Les.
think that's an important part of your book.
It sounds like you've got a phenomenal position there, and that's what we would all want in terms of a physician, somebody who could assess what's going on, work as our ally, take their experience and so take out the specifics of what we're dealing with, and then use evidence-based medicine, the current science to interpret that and to make recommendations to us so we could then make decisions on what we should do next. And that gets into the currently our healthcare system is largely based upon payments for doing procedures and doesn't reimburse physicians to spend that time in teaching and really being a consultant resource to us. So fortunately, there are physicians who are doing that, but we would certainly like to see much more of that occur.
Right. And I think that and this is an aspect of the book as well, that I think educating the consumers of healthcare, the people who are going to physicians or therapists, about how to be an active part of that. I'm aware that I know enough to advocate for myself in a way. I feel more confident about advocating that in a way that I might not if I were less familiar with the healthcare system and with some of the facts. I can assimilate those facts in a way because I've been exposed to it. So there's a balancing act in there. But that you raise a great point about the incentives for healthcare providers to do procedures instead of consultation and education.
Yeah, I think that would be,
that's real health
we need to
reform if we can
on.
manage to change that.
You and I can maneuver through the healthcare system because we have inside knowledge of that, and I see that with friends and family where I will help them and advocate for them so that they make the right decisions. But we're sort of blessed because we have that inside knowledge. I think it's much more difficult for someone who doesn't. The other thing I want to share with people, there are some resources, probably some provocative resources on the website livingable.com. If you go to the resources and downloads, there's an agreement in there to bring to your provider about what the responsibilities will be of the provider and what your responsibilities would be. The feedback has been interesting because those who I feel are really enlightened physicians love the agreement. Others who are not so enlightened don't like it. You know? So that's just the way it is.
Right. Yep.
So I'd like, we've had a comment from the audience that I'm going to quote here. For me, abandoning faith in the supernatural has been an integral part of dealing with my disability. I'd love to hear some commentary on that from you guys.
You know, I'll respond first. I saw it come up, and I'm also really intrigued by it. And you know, I'm going to make an assumption here that, you know, this is sometimes the negative part of people who you know, who act on faith or have a really strong faith, is that sometimes when something bad happens, we feel betrayed by this thing that we've put a lot of faith in. And so part of it is taking back ownership of what happens and what happens next. For some people, that might mean abandoning that belief in that supernatural. And for other people, they might find a different way to resolve that issue. I mean, that's the thing. And again, I'm not having a conversation with the person who made that comment, so I'm making some assumptions here. But that was the thing that kind of began rolling through my mind as I talked about it. You know, and Chris, maybe you can talk about sort of a different way, a different slant on
specific to the individual, what their experiences have been. I know that people of faith, whatever faith it may be, when something bad happens, may say, you know, how could God permit this to occur? And therefore, you know, I've been abandoned, or, you know, I need to move away from that. It's just, how do we deal within our faith of situations that just seem to be unacceptable? Why would this occur? And so it's just wrestling with that. And I don't have an easy answer for that.
Yeah. I'm reminded of a quote, and I've of course, now it won't come to mind who said it. But the quote is, I learned when faced with difficulties to ask the right question, to ask what next instead of why me. And again, that's really about taking ownership. And whatever it takes to take that ownership, I think is often part of the healing process.
Excellent point for discussion, guys. I appreciate it. So
thank you, and thanks for the comment.
Yeah, I really appreciate
it was great.
Our participants sharing
about it.
Absolutely.
And I'd love to comment what's next for me rather than why me.
Yeah.
Because if it's why me, again, we're focusing on the past, that this happened, you know. And I find often when we focus, it's sort of like, it can almost become a story. Right. This happened, and that happened, blah, 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 blah. It really doesn't permit me to say, okay, I'm here right now. Where do I want to go? And how do I achieve that? Which is more empowering.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I'm going to segue for a second back into the notion of resilience, because, and we've talked about this, that there's really two components to resilience. There's the characteristics of people that, you know, people who have more resilience have certain characteristics. You can also think of, and Dr. Rob Auerbach and his work really focuses on what you can do to be more resilient, the ways so it's an action, not just a characteristic. And one of those characteristics is making exactly that distinction, that even if you don't feel like it, even if you're feeling, why me? And I mean, let's be honest, when something terrible happens, I think it goes through our minds, why me? What happened? What's wrong? It certainly happens to me. I'll own it sometimes that's the case. If I can just ask myself that question, what's next? I've developed that habit. Even when I feel terrible and like some terrible thing has happened to me, if I can just ask, okay, now what do I do? It begins to shift that focus into action and taking responsibility. And I think that's helpful.
Something's happened, or I feel that I've contributed to in a negative way, and that's certainly more often than I want. I want to learn from that so I don't repeat that. But beating myself up doesn't it doesn't seem to be therapeutic. It doesn't really be moving forward. So I love that approach. And then I like what you shared too in the current issue of Work, the publication by the Disability Management Employers Coalition. Your article, I think, was Human Resistance is the Key to Better Work Outcomes, where you re-explored issues of resilience and how that helps us stay at work or return to work.
And that was really that's really the heart of it. Something you said, Chris, made me also think that, often I think that same thing. I'm actually more inclined to think, why me, when it's someone that I'm close to, when it's someone I care about, than for me. If it happens to me, then I'm pretty good at dealing with it most of the time. But if somebody I care about has had something happen, then it's often, then I'm looking for the explanation. It's just a phenomenon that I saw.
And dealing with the illness within immediate family, of saying, why did that happen, and what do I do? And many times thinking it would be far easier if it was me than that other person.
Right.
So I'm going to move us into the next response we got, because I think they're fascinating and also somewhat relatable to a lot of this. Because the next one is choosing to be proactive in completing your goals.
So doesn't that get back into the message of taking charge of responsibility, of being proactive, that rather than reacting to the situation, moving forward?
Yeah, I think it does. It also puts me in mind that sometimes I think we do ourselves a disservice by focusing so much on being proactive around goals, thinking that the point is to accomplish, to whatever it is that we set out to do. I'm going to write a book by the end of the year, and I may have written 10 out of 12 chapters, but if I haven't finished it, then I feel like a failure. Being proactive needs to focus on the activity and not necessarily, in my mind, rather than the goal, it needs to focus on the activity. Frankly, if I get 10 out of 12 chapters done by the end of the year, I'm going to feel pretty darn good. But I think we can trap ourselves if that notion of being proactive
it's sort of like having a journey of focusing on the destination rather than the journey itself. And I think as much as and so it just
you never get to be there.
I think too with goals, there's part is I like to have goals that you stretch to, but at the same time, if the goals are unrealistic, you don't achieve them, then you feel badly about that. So sometimes my own self is I set my goals so high, and I should be happy if I achieved half of that, and I achieved 3/4 of it, but I didn't achieve it all, and now I feel bad. Right. So, maybe I need to see you for some sessions, Les.
I'm guessing, knowing you, that doesn't work so well.
All right. So I'm going to keep rolling. So the next response we got, the final response we have here to discuss, being a working, contributing part of society. After 3 back surgeries, the last being a spinal fusion, it was important to me to get back to any normal life and activities. Chris, I'm going to let you take this one to start.
Going through all that person went through, and having that positive orientation that despite having these major interventions, and we know that particularly with some interventions, particularly like lumbar fusions, that often the outcomes are not very good, that this person wanted to have a normal life, and also to be contributing to society, and I think part of that is working. And what we've learned is that work is healthy. That not working is very risky in terms of increasing our likelihood of having other physical illnesses, mental issues, that by this person having this positive focus, that they give purpose to who they are, they give identity to that. And I just applaud that person for, despite these challenges that they've had, keeping that as a clear goal and achieving that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would put it in the category, I'll segue into the category of mental health. I think and this frankly is something that I see my professional colleagues make what I think is a mistake around, by psychologists and other psychotherapists, that when someone becomes really severely depressed, or they have a traumatic experience and they're experiencing some symptoms of anxiety, or perhaps even as severe as post-traumatic stress disorder, a really important part of recovering and getting better is becoming more functional. And too often with mental health conditions, we think that people need to be better before they can go back to becoming functional and going back to, and in fact, that should be a really important part of the recovery. My flippant way of saying this is that I've never thought it was a good idea for my depressed patients to stay home and stare at the wall. As soon as possible, getting back into life is just a huge component of getting better. It's true whether it's physical or psychological.
Absolutely, it's very therapeutic, and it's part of the individual realizing that. It's for the employer to accommodate that. It's for the physician to be realistic in the process, and not. I see more often that people will inappropriately restrict people from doing things without considering what the issue that, I have a person with a health condition, they have work to do. What is their risk of doing certain activities? What's their capacity? What's their tolerance? That it's just too easy to say not work, and work itself is very therapeutic and very healthy. And I mean, the scientific studies have very much clarified that. I think our own life experiences, and then also my involvement working with the wounded warriors in the Marines, if that we give a focus of activity, and that makes all the difference in the world. So we have to, and I get so concerned when a physician inappropriately removes somebody from work, and particularly when they feel that they're befriending the person by doing that, and that's, you know, so harmful. It's like giving the person opioids for inappropriately for non-cancer related pain, that you feel that you're doing something that's extraordinarily harmful, and we should not tolerate that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right, I think.
So I wanted to broaden the discussion a little bit beyond these responses, and just ask the question of, what are you two observing in terms of receptivity to this concept of living abled and being engaged in your own healthcare?
I'm finding that the field is slowly becoming more accepting of this. I find that particularly if we deal with the legal insurance, that they're often and in healthcare, they're often slow moving, or moving at, someone used the term glacial speeds, very, very slowly. And, you know, then they're starting to realize the significance that we have to be focusing in a positive way in our actions, and even our terminologies. And, you know, and I think we have so many, you know, I was pondering that today, as, you know, I was outside a beautiful day here in Maine, where I had this thought. But we have, let's say, if we take the issue of injury or illness in the context of work, we have workers' compensation. So we focus on workers' compensation in terms of who gets money, what happens with that. Is, you know, why isn't that like workers' recovery? Why are we using all these negative terms? And I think people are starting to back and say, hey, you know, things are not really, you know, working well, and we have to start looking at this in a different way. I'm also finding that the issue of dealing with the whole person is starting to get acceptance. That before, so often we just focused on the physical issues. We didn't deal with the psychosocial issues, which were often the critical issues in terms of function, that people are starting to say, yeah, okay, maybe I do have to think that way. So there is some movement. I'd like to see it, you know, accelerate, because I think the costs, particularly the personal costs of needless disability, are too high. They shouldn't exist as they do. But I do see some movement in you know, the past couple of years. Les, what are your thoughts on that? Am I naive, or do you think something's happening?
Les, the question to you was, and you seem to have lost, I don't know if you can hear me, but okay, good, which is really is, you know, Chris feels like this, you know, this is moving in a positive direction, albeit slowly. And so really just threw that same question into your court.
Okay. Yeah, and hopefully I'm not just repeating what Chris said. I don't know what happened to that part of the feed, because I'm hearing you fine and seeing you fine. I think of it as trying to turn the Titanic in the water with a string tied around your finger. You know, if you can do it if you exert a little bit of force over a long period of time. You know, it's hard to answer in some ways, because often I feel like we're preaching to the choir. We're talking to other like-minded people. I do think that I think two things are happening. I think that the medical and the healthcare profession generally, both mental and physical, I think is beginning to change, because I think we're looking for ways to help people become more functional. I also think that patients are changing and taking more, you know, because intuitively this makes, I think that what we're saying today intuitively makes sense to most people. That we're just going to do everything we can with what we've got. I think that makes sense to most of us. Certainly, there are some people for whom that's not the case, and you know they have a tendency to give up. But I actually think the most common response is to be resilient, to look for ways to become proactive and to recover.
And unless I agree with that, I think we have different levels of skills, but that is a characteristic that most of us have. But it's the same.
Now I'm worried that you may have
No,
lost
I can hear
me.
you. And
Okay.
I'm not sure if Les can hear me, but it's, you know, I think that it's also how do we enhance our skills of resiliency, and how do we take steps to empower and engage and educate people in the process of controlling their destinies. And that was really one of the focus of writing Living Abled, is for all of us to better deal with injury or illness.
Excellent. Gentlemen, because of some technical issues, I think we're going to end this about 10 minutes early. I think we've had a great discussion, but Les has lost audio, which makes it kind of difficult for the two of you to talk to each other. So this has really been, you know, again, this has been an excellent discussion, and I'd just like to mention that both Les and Chris Brigham will be at the National Workers' Compensation and Disability Conference in New Orleans. And Chris will be there with his book in the R3 Continuum booth and making signed copies available. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to R3 Continuum via our website, our Twitter feed, or through this channel. Thank you all very much for coming today.
And John, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great
It's been
conversation.
great. Thanks.
Have a great day.
Thanks, guys. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.